Hi, I'm Austin, and welcome back to the Marshall Modification Project. This channel explores Marshall amp modification from an academic perspective.
And I'm Yang Yang, and today we have Mike Soldano with us. He's going to walk us through his journey as an amp modder. Anyway, enjoy the interview.
First question is pretty straightforward, really, Mike. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience modifying Marshall amplifiers? So can you give us a little bit of background of how all of that kind of came together?
Okay. Well, it started quite a long time ago. What a lot of people don't know is I originally started building guitars before I started doing amp stuff. So back in the late 70s and early 80s, I had a very tiny little one-man business part-time building guitars. And what would happen was customers I had would bring in their amps to see if I could fix them, which, I had at that time, I had a very, very rudimentary understanding of electronics, but I could use a soldering iron and I wasn't afraid to just dive into something and give it a go. So I started doing some minor and, some simple amp repairs alongside the guitar work. And of course, the first thing that sort of came from that was like, can you modify my amp? Well, sure, I guess, we can take a shot at it. And again, I hadn't quite, taught myself all the electronics that I really needed to know to be totally competent at this. But at the same time, I wasn't afraid to just, goof around and try things out. So long story short, I started kind of tinkering with amps. A lot of them were just like little Fender Bassmans, the occasional Marshall would come across my bench. And it was always simple things like, well, most of the time it was just a tube would fail and they didn't know how to change tubes. So it was often really simple. But, from time to time, there'd be stuff like, I don't know, a fried resistor here or there, or a blown filter cap or something on some of the older amps. Nothing really major, but it got me really interested in learning more about that stuff. So that's when that's kind of when I began teaching myself electronics, because I'm self-taught. I've learned it all out of books and stuff. And asking a lot of questions of people that I knew more than I did. So that helped too. So anyway, at the same time that I was doing all this, there was kind of an ulterior motive to me actually being a guitar maker. And that was, I needed a better guitar for myself. And so that's how I learned how to build guitars. So I couldn't afford a good guitar. So I figured I could build one. And all of that was leading towards the fact that I wanted to be like, a professional musician. I wanted to play guitar, and I was working hard towards that goal. And the one thing though that was eluding me in my personal quest was I couldn't find a sound that really did. I had a sound in my head that I wanted to hear, and it wasn't happening. I thought, okay, try different pickups, let's do some crazy guitar designs. Let's see if we can do it that way. But of course, it didn't take long for me to realize that the real tone generator, if you want to call it that, is the amplifier. I mean, you can pretty much plug any guitar into a really good amp and it'll still sound pretty good. But if you plug a really good guitar into a crappy amp, it's still going to sound really bad. So, so I realized, okay, I need to focus more attention on the amp thing. And that's where the mods started happening. So, I kind of was tinkering around. Again, I had no money, so I was just playing whatever I could get my hands on. And back in those days, you could buy little, mid-60s Fender Bassman heads for about $35, $40. They were so inexpensive. Nobody wanted them. They were just kind of these like little underdogs you'd find in record stores and swap shops and stuff because they just weren't that popular an amp. But they were really easy to work on and they're easy to modify. So I started just messing around with the little Fender Bassmans and stuff. And of course, Marshalls were still kind of like too expensive for me, because they were, at that time, there weren't that many on the used market. They were still something you kind of had to go to a music store and buy new. So I didn't really have access to Marshalls at that point in my life. But later, I managed to scrape up some dough and I bought a 100-watt JMP. And that was my first Marshall. Great amp, loved it. And then I still didn't have the sound bill I wanted. It just wasn't there. I still hadn't really quite gotten my chops honed yet for the mod thing. So I was like, well, what's the current amp that everybody's using that has extreme sustain, high gain, all that? Well, at the time, by this time, it's 1979. And so one of my favorite guitarists has always been Carlos Santana. So of course, I just loved the sounds he was getting, the sustain or all the overdrive. So I was like, well, what's he play? He's playing Boogie. So I saved and saved and saved and saved. And I bought myself a brand new Mesa Boogie Mark II. And when I got it, it was like, whoa, this is really great. Wow, look at this. I'm Carlos. This is awesome. But I almost immediately started realizing there were certain shortcomings that just were really bothering me. And one was that it seemed like when I needed to get a really good high gain sound, I couldn't get a good clean sound. And what really perplexed me was the tone controls. I noticed that if I wanted more bass, I actually had to turn the bass down because if I turned the bass up on the amp, it caused more distortion in the bass frequencies, which made the bass even thinner and worse. And I never noticed that with the Marshall. See, so I started noticing that there were these differences between my total stock. I hadn't touched it yet. My stock GMP and this at the time, state-of-the-art high gain amp, which was the Mesa Mark II. And so, I was like, okay, there's something here. I'm not digging what I've got. I got to figure this out. So I'm like, well, hey, let's build an amp. And I happened at the time to meet a very sharp young electronics engineer named Doug Roberts. And Doug is the son of the late Howard Roberts, the jazz guitarist. And so I met Doug through an ad I had in the newspaper because I was actually selling that Marshall had because I had to pay for the Boogie I just bought. And so we met, we became good friends. I built a guitar for Doug. And during our course of, hanging out together and geeking out on guitar stuff, we toyed around the idea. I told him about how I needed a better amp and I wanted to build an amp. And he's like, hey, that would be fun. Let's do that. And so he and I sat down and we designed this amp that we thought would be pretty awesome. And I did all the mechanical design, the circuit board layout, all the physical part. And he did most of the electronics because he was brilliant. And to this day, he holds many patents in the world of bio electronics and all that kind of stuff, hard defibrillators, that kind of thing. I'm not really sure all of it. But anyway, brilliant guy, still a good friend of mine. Anyhow, we built this amp. Again, it was a step, and we actually used Marshall transformers in it because that's what I could get my hands on to build a 100-watt amp. So I bought a set of replacement Marshall. We both bought a set of Marshall replacement transformers, and then we built our amp around those. Did it sound good? Yeah, it had a killer clean sound. The overdrive was still sort of lacking. We were using diode clipping, and it just, at the end of the day, it just didn't sound great. Anyhow, so I'm getting probably way off the beaten track here. that opened my eyes to electronics, because working with Doug, I learned a lot of basics of it instantly. I mean, it's just like osmosis. I was just soaking it in. And so that prompted me to really hunker down on my book reading and learn more and more about how all this vacuum tube stuff worked. So I spent about, well, all said, about 4 years teaching myself electronics before I really was able to build my first amp from scratch. But during that time, I started gaining confidence to do amp mods, and so that's when these guitar customers I had would start bringing me their amps to get modded. And so, sure enough, a few Marshalls came across my bench, and I looked at them, and I was like, "Hey, this is a pretty straightforward circuit. Um, Power section looks just like a 1956 Fender Bassman, so this is easy for me to relate to and wrap my head around." And so the first mods I started doing were basically just trying to fatten up the sound a little bit, because the biggest complaint, not complaint, but the biggest request I was getting was that they wanted a thicker sound, which I could totally understand. That was sort of where I was going as well. And so, I would just do little minor mods, like just changing some capacitors here and there and some resistors, just to change the tone shaping of the amp. And that was basically way up in the front end of the preamp. I was just kind of reshaping the the interstage uh, filters, for lack of a better word. I mean, the interstage, the coupling stages, and so that was the place where you could influence frequency and change how hard you were hitting the next tube with whatever signal was coming from the first tube, and that would influence, of course, the amount of distortions, the frequencies, etc. The cool thing I noticed was the tone controls in the Marshall, because of their placement, had much better effect with distorted signals than my Boogie did, or some of those other Fender amps I was working with, where the tone controls are way up in the front of the amp. And so I kind of took a hard look at that, and I was like, this makes sense. The tone stack is after all the distortion. And so therefore I can pick out frequencies I want of that already distorted signal and boost those before going to the power amp, rather than pushing, say, more bass into the preamp, causing more distortion on the preamp in the preamp, which of course is now creating more upper end harmonics, and I'm losing all the bottom end. So I immediately saw that there was a big plus side to that. And so based on that, I was like, okay, this is a pretty sound foundation to do mods on. So I kind of started preferring doing the Marshall mods, because the power amp and the tone stack were where I wanted them to be. All I had to do now is get a preamp sound that would do what I wanted. And of course, that's where, even just doing all those little tweaks I did, I could never get the gain really up, but I was still lacking in gain. So I decided, well, okay, I need to do something different there. Well, by that time, I was also making a lot of progress on this amp I was designing for myself on my little test bench in my little electronics lab I'd set up in my bedroom. So I was working full time during the day in an auto body shop, and then at night I'd come home, have a little dinner, and then I would go and sit in my room and work until like 2 a.m, and try things out and keep, expanding my learning, because I had, like, say, all these old 1940s Army Navy textbooks that I got from the public library that I was learning about electronics from. I was, taking every amp that I possibly could get my hands on. I was taking them apart and studying, how they look, how they work, drawing schematics off the circuits, and then trying to figure out how those different parts of the circuits were working. And so I had, by that time, developed what later, very, very soon after, became what is now known as the 100-watt super lead overdrive. So I had come up with this overdrive circuit that was really the key to, quote, the Soldano sound. And I was like, okay, maybe I could take this circuit, and because I had it working on my little breadboard, I had, a fully functional amp built on a piece of plywood, basically, and it sounded great. I mean, I was really super happy with it. I was really zeroing in on it. But I decided, like, how cool would it be if I just stuck this in a real amp just to, see how it works? And at the time I had a customer who had Marshall, he wanted modded. So I was like, hey, are you willing to let me try some on this? And sure enough. And so punched an extra hole in the chassis, added another 12AX7, and then everything from the phase inverter back, I changed to the circuit that I had in my little plywood breadboard. And I came up with a mod that sounded, to me, absolutely fantastic. It was really great. And of course, it's the 80s, so I nicknamed the mod the Metal Master mod because their heavy metal was all the rage then. And still is, but that was kind of the name I gave it. And basically it was the front end of what later became the SLO-100. The SLO, of course, I added a second channel, put some channel switching in there, and got all that going. But basically, that was my mod. That was like my signature Marshall mod. So moving forward from that, I went on to build a complete SLO-100 on its own chassis, a real amp. And I finally had my sound. It was like, this is great. This is what I want. And other people heard that and they're like, hey, can you build me one of those? I'm like, well, I could, sure, And so it was a very rocky start. But from that, I started Soldano Custom Amplification. And part of my motivation for doing that was I was realizing that with all these amazing guitarists that were popping up everywhere in the 80s, that my chops were never going to catch up with theirs. And so I kind of bagged the whole idea of being a professional guitarist and decided maybe I can make a living building tools for guitarists. And that's why I started my amp company. And of course, the rest is history. But even after I started Soldano Custom Amps, I'd moved to Hollywood, California at this point. I was born and raised in Seattle, and that's where I was up till then. I moved to Hollywood, established my first shop, starved for about a year, then things kind of started picking up. But during that time, nobody really knew about the amps I was building, but a few guys that stopped by my shop heard what I had, and they go, well, I can't afford to have you build me something, but I have this Marshall. Could you mod that Marshall for me? And I'm like, of course I could. And so I started doing Marshall mods to sort of pay the bills while I was trying to get some name recognition for this amp that I built, which, quite a bit more expensive, let's put it that way, than buying a Marshall. So a lot of players that weren't ready yet to throw down, well, back then, they were only about $1,600, but $1,600 for an amp would come to me in for $350. I'd modify the Marshall. And so even after my amps got off the ground, I got discovered by Steve Luther, and that pretty much got the ball rolling. There was still, I'd get these guys stopping by, and they'd be like, well, can you modify my Marshall? And I'd be, yes, I can. So I just set up like a little side business within my own business. And it was just myself and a couple other guys. And I continued doing Marshall mods. And what was funny was, even though I was in the business of manufacturing Soldano amps, if you walked into my shop on any given day, you'd probably see 3 or 4 Marshalls stacked up by my workbench, and I'd be doing mods on them. So we were doing a lot of Marshall mods, and so were a lot of other guys. I mean, there was Lee Jackson, there was I think gosh, I'm drawing a blank now. Anyway, it doesn't matter. There was a guy out in the valley that was doing stuff. There were a bunch of guys. But people really liked the one I was doing. So long and short of it is that I just never abandoned that. I just kept doing it even through all the years, right up to the time that I semi-retired in Soldano. I was still offering that mod. And I kind of fine-tuned it too. I got it down to where it was just one mod. I mean, you could ask me to tweak it and I was more than happy to do so. But I had it so figured out that it was just like punch the hole, put in the extra preamp tube, change these components on the board. I even had a little way to, use the existing board and just do a little cutting and splicing of traces and a few jumpers here and there, and I could make it all work without even having to change the circuit board. I could just use the existing board and make some modifications. And I added a little auxiliary board that mounted off to the end of the factory circuit board, and I could do it on the non-master models as well as the masters. The cool thing about buying the JMPs though was that they had all the knobs exactly where they needed to be. So I could do a JMP, and from the front of the amp, it looked like a totally stock Marshall. Nobody would ever know the difference. It had a preamp control, master volume, bass, middle, treble, presence, done. 2 input jacks. It was a total sleeper. The only way you could tell it was modded was A, the sound, but also B, you could turn the amp around and look in the back and see that extra 12AX7 in there. But those things were, gosh, I did a lot of those amps. And then the 4-input amps, the non-masters, what I did on those is I would just turn one of the volume controls into a preamp, one was a master. I'd block off 2 of the input jacks, call it good. And so, it still looked like a Marshall from the front. There's no extra knobs, no extra holes in the front of the amp. And guys really seem to like that because they like to have like that secret weapon, that they'd come to a club with, and it would just, everybody go like, oh, just another Marshall, and then they'd plug it in and blow everybody away. And they'd be like, woo, woo, So anyway, so that's kind of how the whole thing worked for me. And again, the amps sounded incredible. They gave a lot of players the ability to get this really high gain, killer, rock sound without breaking the bank. And, the Marshall platform was a good amp to modify because it was rugged. It's a pretty durable amp, pretty well built, nice heavy duty chassis, good power supply, and so, yeah, that's how I did it.
Brilliant, Mike. You've touched on a few points that we're going to kind of get into in a little bit more detail, but that's really great overview. Can we just rewind a little bit? So you were in Seattle, correct? And then you moved to LA, and you were modding in Seattle, and you were also modding in LA. I'm kind of interested to know, were there any, maybe particularly when you were in Seattle, but also when you were in LA, were there any maybe particular, you mentioned some names, but were there any other modders that you were aware of that were influencing what you were doing? Were you getting ideas from many other people's work? Were there any amps coming in that you could look at when you were in Seattle, or did that happen more in LA? I mean, my question is, were there any kind of modders or kind of technical innovations that were occurring around that time that was impacting what you were doing to those modifications?
For me, no, not really. Seattle, there was nothing going on. I mean, part of it was the fact that I really didn't get out a lot, so I wasn't really. I don't know. I never was really in the scene in Seattle. So I had my customers, of course. I had the guys that found me, but and one of my best customers in Seattle was a guy named Tommy Martin, who unfortunately has passed away at a young age. But anyway, Tommy was kind of a real forward thinker as far as guitar tone and everything else. So he was kind of way ahead of a lot of the other guys that were playing in Seattle at the time. He was always kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. And so I did work for him. I didn't actually ever mod a Marshall for him because he was using Mesa Boogies and he was having good success with them. But I built him a couple pedal boards and I built him a guitar. but we would always have conversations about what a really good amp would be. So Tommy was somewhat involved with the design, not so much the design, but the evolution of the SLO-100, in that when I was prototype, working on my little plywood test bit board that I was building what became the SLO-100 on, I didn't have a place to try it out at high volume because I lived in a residential neighborhood, and the neighbors would complain, if anything got any louder than the sound of the television set. So I would go down to Tommy's rehearsal space, and that's where I would test it out at high volumes. And so Tommy, being kind of a gear geek, would just, he'd be in the room with me, and he'd be playing it as well. And he'd give me feedback. He'd be like, "Hey, I like what you're doing here, but maybe you should try this." And I'd be like, "Well, let's try it and see what happens." So yeah, he had some effect on that. But what was even more, where he had even a greater effect was the fact that his rehearsal space was in one of these buildings. There were a lot of these in Seattle back in those days, where these guys would just rent big old industrial buildings and throw up a bunch of walls and call it a rehearsal place. They did nothing to soundproof between the rooms or anything. So you have all these bands and they're rehearsing, and they're all bleeding off into everybody else's rooms. So it was always chaos in there. But what was cool was, because of that, other guitarists could hear what we were doing in Tommy's room. And when we fired up my prototype, these guys would come in there and go like, "What are you guys playing here? We want to hear this." And that's where I got interest. That's where I learned that there was interest for a better amp. And so it was these guys that were just randomly dropping into Tommy's rehearsal space that were asking me to build amps for them, which gave me the idea to start an amp business. And from that, I also did get one or two Marshall mods, but I hadn't perfected what became the mod yet. So some of those early ones from back in those days were still like not quite the same version. They sounded good, but they weren't as refined as what I finally fine-tuned it to be. But as far as other guys doing mods in Seattle, I didn't know anyone. I mean, I was kind of I was a bit of a loner, for lack of a better word. Not that I didn't want to have, be more involved, but I just didn't really fit in with the scene that well. So Seattle, nothing, nada. When I got to LA, I was aware that there were other guys doing mods, but I wasn't really, by that time I had my amp, the SLO was up and running. I was working on my own designs. And to be honest, and I don't want to sound any way like a snob by saying this, but I just wasn't interested in what other guys were doing. It's like I had my sound. I liked what I was doing. I thought it was pretty cool. And so I didn't really care. And over the years, I've met some of these dudes, and we would talk shop, but I never like opened up a Lee Jackson or a Frank Levi modded Marshall and go, "Oh, I wonder what the circuit is." I just didn't care. I wasn't that interested. And the other thing is generally the only amps that would come in my shop were stock ones. If somebody had a modded Marshall by one of these other guys, they would just take it to that guy because he was already their guy. So I didn't really have the opportunity to see too many of those other ones. Occasionally somebody would bring in an amp that was modded by somebody else, but they didn't like it and they would want me to change it. And because, I was so busy running my biz and doing this other stuff, I didn't really have time to spend with the amp when they brought it in. So I would just immediately strip all the stuff that looked like a mod off the circuit board and then start on my mod, just because, as the old saying goes, time is money. And I needed to get these things done out the door and paid for so that I could keep doing the other stuff I had to do. So to answer your question, no, I wasn't very influenced by others, only because I was either too arrogant to pay attention or I didn't have time. And I think the real truth is to indulge in that.
Yeah, that's interesting. When we spoke to Lee Jackson last night, he kind of said the same thing, that he had his thing, he had his sound, you were doing your thing, and Jose was doing his thing, and players came to them for that sound, really, and that they kind of carved out the market in that way. So yeah, really interesting. Could you I mean, I guess you're going to reference your specific mod. Could you describe? I'm interested, and you can maybe describe it to us both in technical terms, but also in the sonic output, the result, and on the sound, the guitar sound. How your mod, what would be the effect on the original tone? And were you basing these on kind of Super League Plexis or GCM 800s? What was your mod normally going into, Mike? And maybe you could tell us the stock amp versus your tone, and tell us a little bit more about the resultant sound quality.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay. So I was modding. My favorite amps to mod were the JMPs. And the main reason was because they were the easiest ones to mod, because almost everything was already in place. It was already a master volume in there. The tone stack was really close to having the same values the tone stack I was doing. So kind of starting at the power amp and working backwards. I left the power amp basically stock. Meaning, well, it was stock. I just changed one resistor in the presence control circuit. And the reason I did that was because on a stock Marshall, the presence knob doesn't do a whole lot. It's a pretty passive circuit. So even in a Soldano, it doesn't do a whole lot, but it does a whole lot more in a Soldano than it does in a Marshall. So I would change one resistor in the presence circuit, which would give it more range. At the top of at 10, it would be the same as stock Marshall would be, but as you backed it down, there was more subtlety as you rolled it off. So we just gave it a little more range. And then the tone stack, the Marshall tone stack was pretty good as is. Again, it wasn't quite as responsive as what I'd like to have heard. And so I changed one resistor, one capacitor in the tone stack, and that gave the mid-range control a lot more effect than it had on stock Marshall, as well as pumping. It fluffed up the bass a little bit as well. The treble was about the same. On the JMPs, I didn't have to modify the treble control. On the Plexis and earlier ones, they have a smaller cap for the treble, which makes it a little bit thinner. And so I would change that cap. So I'd go from a 270 picofarad to a 470 picofarad. The later amps already had the 470 picofarad. So the tone stack was really pretty close to what I wanted right already. So the real changes happened back preamp before all that stuff. So like, as I mentioned before, the first thing I would do is I added an extra 12AX7 in the front end of the amp, right at the very beginning of the gain stages. And the thing I think the thing that maybe separated how I was doing it from maybe how some of the other guys were doing it was the amount of gain. And again, because I didn't study their mods, I don't really know what they're doing, but I could kind of hear it. I think a lot of guys that were doing amp mods back then were trying to get a lot of gain in one stage of the amp. Like, just take one tube and just hit it as hard as they could, crank it as far as it could go, and get all the squish, all the distortion right there in that one tube, and then, off to the races they go. The problem with that is when you do that, you lose a lot of the fundamental frequencies, because you squash the signal so much and you convert so much of it into a square wave that you lose all that information that really gives it its character and its depth and its finesse and all those other things. And so my whole design philosophy and what's been kind of what's, again, propelled that particular sound that my circuits make is that I don't hit any one tube real hard. It's kind of like I take it up a little bit at a time. I boost the signal, but then I cut a lot of it away. And then I hit the next tube and distort it just a little bit. I don't distort it a lot. And then I take that and I cut a little bit of that away and hit the next stage. So instead of trying to get all the gain in one stage, I'm kind of stacking it up. And by doing so, I can keep the tubes more in that soft area right before they clip hard. Like if you look like a sine wave, the tube goes into clipping, it clips off the top and the bottom and squares it off. If you hit it real hard, that square corner gets really sharp. But if you don't hit it so hard, it rounds it out a little bit before it flattens out. And that's where all the juicy harmonics, all that stuff is, right in that little part where it kind of rounds out. So what sonically, what I was looking for was something with way more gain than a stock Marshall, but that didn't lose character and that also had definition and articulation. And that's the other thing that happens when you distort it too really, when you hit the distortion really hard, you lose a lot of articulation because it just everything fuzzes out and you don't hear any of the subtle differences. And so it gets to this place where it almost doesn't matter which pickup you're on the guitar or what guitar you're even playing. You could have a Strat, you could have a Les Paul, you could have humbuckers, single coils, you could be on the neck, you could be on the bridge. The sound coming out of the speakers would almost always be the same because all you're doing is squashing everything really hard at the front end, and you're losing all the little subtleties that make those things sound different. And so one of the best compliments I ever got when I first started getting my amps out in the world, and my mods, same thing, was from a recording engineer at Ocean Way Studios in LA. When I first heard, well, in this case, it was an SLO-100. It was not Marshall. It was an SLO. And the thing that he said was he was so amazed at the fact that for a high gain amp, it was so transparent, because he said that, his experience had been that a lot of his clients would come in and they'd bring in their Mesas and whatnot. And pretty much the sound he was picking up in the microphone was the same regardless, whatever guitar they were playing, it didn't really matter. Notice that when people came in with Soldanos, that, he could not only tell the difference between, a single coil and a humbucker pickup, but he could tell the difference between two different Les Pauls. It was like the amp kept the integrity of sound of all the nuances of those various instruments. And I thought that was really cool. I was like, yeah, and then the other compliment I got from players was, and especially in the 80s when guys were just playing like at 1,000,000 miles an hour, was they loved the articulation. It's like a lot of really high gain amps that kind of fuzz out. When you start playing really fast and playing really intricate lines, a lot of it just turns into mush. It gets real blurry. And blurry is a weird word used for sound because obviously blurry has to do with vision. But since we don't have all the words for sound, we have to kind of take and switch, other words we do understand. Like Eddie Van Halen, a brown sound. Well, what's a brown sound? How do you color a sound? But that's the whole deal. Anyway, what they liked was the articulation, and they liked that you could play something more than just a simple 2-note fifth chord, and it would still, and you could hear it. So, hard rock, heavy metal, you don't really need much more than a fifth. But when you want to play a diminished chord or a minor or something else, it's nice if you can hear all the notes. And that's something that my mods and my amps could do that a lot of the other high gain, not so articulate amps couldn't do. They just, again, they sound like mush and get all these weird, excuse me, these weird ringing harmonics that didn't fit in with the basic sound of the chord. And I think part of that's because so many of those really high gain mods lost the lower the longer harmonics, like the fundamental, the first order, the second order, those would disappear pretty quickly with all that distortion. You could end up with these really short order harmonics that sure, they sounded like, a buzzsaw, but they didn't have any of the musicality left in them. And so that's kind of part of what separated a Soldano modded Marshall from a Marshall with just a fuzz box in front of it, for example. If you just nail the front end of a Marshall and distort it really hard, it's going to not sound as good as if you the distortion up through various stages. And the way I did that in the amp was I had many gain stages. I started out one stage right off the buffer from the input jack. I boost the signal up. I immediately, right after that, we cut a fairly large portion of the low frequency out because the output from a guitar, if you look at it like on a scope, for example, the bass strings have way more amplitude than the high strings because the low strings have more mass, or not so much the mass, but their magnetic pull on the pickup. So they generate a higher voltage because of their heaviness and they have more energy in them than the high strings. And so if you want to get a really nice distorted sound, you don't want the bass to start distorting before the treble notes, because otherwise it just goes into fuzz land really early and you lose the fundamentals and the bass goes away. And that was the biggest problem with the Mesa Boogie was the tone stack was in the front of the amp. So when you turned up the bass control, you were actually making the bass worse because you were putting more bass signal into the next stage tube, the big distortion tube. And so you were distorting the bass more than you wanted, or more, which was taking away the fundamental, which was making it sound less bassy. So the real key to getting a good sound out of a Mesa Boogie, at least those early ones that had the graphic EQs on them and stuff, was just to turn the bass off, turn the mids off, crank the treble, and then do everything with the graphic EQ, because the graphic EQ came after the preamp, which is where the tone stack should be in a high gain amp, according to me. And so anyway, so sonically, that's what was different. The stock JMP was a cool rock amp. It had great crunch, great rhythm sound, just big crunchy, 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 crunchy. A little bit thin, maybe, because the bottom wasn't so good. But it was a classic rock sound. We all loved it. But when you wanted that singing lead tone, it didn't have enough gain, and it just wasn't fat enough. And so my mod was to make it fatter and make it sustain a long time. And to do that, you need compression to get that sustain. And part of what I discovered, quite by accident, I will say, I'm not a genius. This all happened by accident. But what I discovered when I was designing my circuit, which became the groundwork for all my amp designs, was I came up with a little circuit that at the time that I stumbled onto it, I didn't fully understand it. It took me, after it worked, I had to then revert, I had to go backwards and figure out why it worked. But what I did was, this is a little sidetrack, but it's a entertaining story. So like I told you, as I mentioned earlier, when I was working on these apps, it was usually like late at night after my day job. And so I was usually some days more than others, more tired than I was. And so one night I was working on my little breadboard, and I had a little circuit I had drawn on a piece of paper while I was eating my dinner that I wanted to try it. I had like a little attenuating network between stages so that I could control how much, again, like I say, I'm trying to limit how much I'm distorting each tube stage. And so I drew this thing up on a napkin or a piece of paper, and it was like, okay, I'm going to build this tonight. I sit down. So I sat down, my little plywood thing that had a bunch of terminal strips on it, parts everywhere. And I soldered together this little thing and, dropped some resistors in, put some wires on, fired up. And I got done, it was like, by the time I was done, it's 2 a.m. And I hit a chord. I'm like, whoa, this is really something. This is doing what I want it to do. But I was too tired to work any further. So I just shut everything down, went to bed, got up the next day, went to work. Well, when I came home that evening and started looking at what I did, I realized, and so I was, looking at my notes and my little circuit I drew, and I realized I didn't wire right. I had mixed the terminal, I had all these terminal strips, and it was easy to get confused as to which one was which. You got all these parts laid across. And so I had accidentally put this one resistor in a place that it wasn't supposed to be. But it was the key to what I then later coined the term controlled clipping. And that is sort of the key to the whole Soldano deal. And what it is, and I'm going to get a little technical here. So if it gets too techie, just tell me to back off, because it's not really important. But if you want to know the techie part, I'll give you the techie part. It's a resistor that goes in series with the grid on a tube. And so on the tube. So when you put the signal into the tube that you're distorting, what happens is, as the grid goes more and more positive, that's when the tube turns on. And when you turn the tube on too much, that's when you get distortion. Well, the cool thing about this little mistake I made was that as the signal hit this resistor, when it first hit it, and it started conducting grid current, the resistor actually limited the voltage that was hitting the tube. So there was current going through the resistor, causing a voltage drop. So it limited the amount of voltage that was actually getting the tube. So even though I was putting a really hot signal into the tube, not all of it was getting to the tube, because as the tube got further and further into its distortion phase, it started conducting grid current. The grid current is self-limiting, so it actually was working like a little compressor. And so when you hit so I could hit the tube really hard. This little series resistor would drop the voltage because the tube was now pulling grid current, because it went positive. When the grid goes positive, it starts pulling current. So the grid would go positive, and then so it would start limiting the signal. So you'd hit it really hard, it would compress, because now the incoming signal is being limited. But as the input signal started decaying, the tube would be like it would start moving back into its more linear operating place, and then it would stop pulling as much grid current. And so now there'd be less of a voltage drop across the resistor. So now more voltage is from this signal that's decreasing on the other side of the resistor. As it was going down, the little gate, which is the resistor, was opening wider. So the tube was seeing the same voltage for a very long time, because as the grid was becoming less positive, it was letting more signal through, which was maintaining that same signal level. So what was happening is it was a very, very crude and rudimentary but effective compressor circuit. So once I had that figured out, I realized I could put a stronger signal. I could throw a stronger signal at the tube without worrying about overly squashing it and overly distorting it. And that way I was getting this really cool thing where on the attack, it would block. And then as the signal decreased, it would release and it would swell. And that's where you get this big, full sustain that was very controllable, because during the whole time, the tube that was being distorted in a pretty even way. It wasn't like getting hit really hard and then fading away. It was getting hit kind of softly, because this resistor is blocking. And then as the signal was dying on the other side of the resistor, the tube could, just get more signal, so it could continue sustaining. So that's kind of the whole secret to the Soldano sound right there. There's that one little resistor in the grid circuit. And then by taking that and again doing some interstage frequency adjustments, I could, like I say, I could temper that hard hit that the bass strings would put on it. I could kind of boost those higher frequencies so they could have a stronger signal so they could sustain longer. And then counter all that brightness from boosting those high signals later in the chain after they've gotten up to that nice comfortable place and they're sustaining for a long time. I could then just cut off the top end and get rid of all that annoying sizzle and come out with this really nice fat round smooth sustainy overdrive. So there's the secrets. You got the whole enchilada right there.
You get so it's kind of to summarize, it's kind of a happy accident and a bit of lack of sleep kind of revolutionized the sound of rock guitar tones.
Basically, that's all they got. It's true.
Awesome, really interesting. Thanks for all the detail on that, Mike. Again, that's all this rich stuff is what we're after. Yeah, for our analysis, absolutely perfect. I'll hand you over to Jan, who's got some more questions. Again, I think you probably touched on a few of these topics already, but we'll rewind and get a little bit more detail on some of these points.
Yeah, but first of all, I'm gonna tell all my friends that basically a happy accident is partially responsible for what we love now, being the modern metal sound. That's amazing. Thanks for that. Thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate it. So you kind of touched it on this topic briefly, but I was just wondering if you can elaborate on how the circuit design of Marshall amps enable or complicate your mods compared to other amps that you've worked on.
Yes. Okay. So the reason Marshalls were so receptive for my mod is that they already had all the key parts in the right place. So, as you know, as pretty much everybody knows, the original Marshall, the JTM 45, was basically pretty much a carbon copy of the 1956 Fender Bassman, the Tweed Bassman, which was basically a circuit designed by some engineers at Western Electric back in probably the 1930s or 1940s or something. Some totally unknown engineers revolutionized rock guitar, decades later with this really simple circuit. And I don't mean that to be in any way derogatory. It's just that those guys came up with a great design back in the 30s that just happened to be a really, really, really good audio amplifier. Very simple to build, very efficient. Well, pretty efficient, but beautiful in its simplicity. I'll just say that because trust me, when I was designing the SLO-100, I was actually trying to do something that nobody's ever done before, just so that I could, really, I'm going to be really cool and do something nobody's done, And I had all these different circuits for the power amp that I was working on that had these really goofy phase splitters. And I was working with these really strange tone stacks that were all, I had all these weird filters that I thought, this will have more Q, a much sharper filter. I can really fine tune these frequencies more and blah, blah, blah. In fact, even the amp, that very, very first amp that Doug Roberts and I built together, we experimented with having active tone controls. Notice we actually had 12 AX7s with various filters feeding them for each frequency in the tone stack, so that we had active controls, because the tone stack in a Marshall and in most guitar amps is passive. It's like you put a signal in with all these different frequencies and then you just cut away everything. You aren't boosting in particular frequency, you're just cutting stuff away. Well, it turns out that works the best. You can get, there's a place for active filters, like a mixing console is a perfect place for, you need that. and probably in just about every other piece of audio gear, active, active filters are probably better because you can get way sharper uh, frequency specification. Like you can really fine tune, you can really split it up, you can get real sharp cues and all that kind of stuff. But in a guitar amp, that's not what you're looking for. In a guitar amp, you want something, for lack of a better word, more organic. You want something where you're not really screwing with it too much. You're just trying to kind of find this nice blend of the low frequencies, the mids, and the highs without a whole lot of separation between them. They all kind of need to work together. And so that tone stack, that very rudimentary, simple tone circuit that was in the Bassman that became the Marshall was perfect. And like I say, I tried a lot of other stuff just for the sake of being different because I didn't want to look like, I was copying anything. But at the end of the day, I came back to that Western Electric circuit because, Leo Fender got it right. Jim Brand at Marshall got it right. Brand. They saw the beauty in it. They saw that, hey, this is simple, it's elegant, and it works for the frequency range that a guitar sits in. It's a nice, and it's user friendly. See, that's the other problem. If you get into something where you have filters that are too notchy and too over the top, specialized, your average guitar player isn't going to know, like, oh, well, let's turn up the 850 hertz there. That's where I'm looking for. No, they want bass, middle, and treble. That's all they want. They don't want to know what the frequency is. They don't want to know any of that. They just want to know what basically they want. So anyway, because the Marshall was based on the Fender, and because Soldano was based on that same circuit, we had a common platform right out of the gate. So, so that lent itself very well to being modded because I didn't have to do a lot to change any of that stuff. The tone controls were exactly where I wanted them in the circuit. The power amp was brilliantly simple, brilliantly effective. You look at the power section in a Marshall, and you look at the power section in the Soldano, and you look at the power section in a 1956 Fender Twin Bassman, and they're identical. I mean, we use the same phase splitter. All we do is use different power tubes. I used 6L6s because I was here in America, and that's what was available. Marshall used EL34s because that was what was available in Europe. And they do have different characteristics. The tubes do have different characteristics. I chose 6L6s because I liked what they did for the cleaner sounds. They were 6L6s were more transparent. They didn't color the sound as much. EL34s tend to color the sound, which is fine for that thing. But I like the 6L6s myself. However, the EL34s and the Marshall responded really well to the mods I put in front of them. So no problem, right? So the Marshall is a great platform to build on. And then moving back through the amp, again, a lot of the stuff was already there that I needed. So the cathode follower that drives the tone stack, well, it's not much different than the one in the Soldano. So all I have to do is change a few resistors, and boom, the Marshall cathode follower is doing exactly what I needed to do to drive the tone stack, to drive the power amp. So then getting into the preamp, all I need there is the right number of 12X7s. Well, the Marshall had, one 12X7 in the front end. I needed two, so I could have 4 stages of gain instead of just 2. And so I just drilled a hole, added an extra socket, and plenty of real estate on that nice big chassis. So I could drop that tube in, wire into it, build my little auxiliary board for the extra parts I needed for that first preamp tube, and away we go. And so I think that's why the Marshall was the most natural amp to accept and responded the best, I should say, also to my mods. I could mod a Fender. I could take a tweet, or not a tweet because I didn't modify the tweet. They're too valuable as they were, but I could take a silver face twin And I could do that mod, but I had to do so many changes to the amp because none of the architecture in that twin was where I needed it to be, with the exception of the power tube sockets and the phase inverter. Like the tone stack was way up in the front of the amp. So I had to completely tear that apart, and reposition all the components. And the problem was that when I would do that with those Fenders, I ended up having to move so many things around in the chassis. And then I had to run all these shielded wires. I use a lot of coax in there because the controls weren't really where they should have been as far as proximity for getting like high frequency bleed over and which would cause oscillation and stuff like that. So the Fender amps, even though I could put my mod in a silver face twin, for example, the amount of work it took was so much more than if I just started with a Marshall, which already had about 75% of what I needed done to it already. So the Marshall just lent itself better to the mods than just about any other amp out there. Did that answer the question properly, or was it different?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah,
Oh,
great answer. Awesome. Yeah. So the next question, we're just wondering, because earlier you mentioned guitarists like Tommy and the guitarists you dealt with. We're just wondering, how have the guitarist demands for specific tones or their performance needs shaped your approach to modding Marshall amps?
well, that's interesting. I never really got on the Marshall mods. I never really got a lot of feedback because generally the guys I would do them for would be just like, because I always say, hey, if you don't like this, bring it back, we'll tweak it a little bit or whatever. I never heard from them again. Well, I mean, I hear from them, for just routine maintenance stuff, but there was never anything they really wanted to change. The only time the only requests I ever had were occasionally, guys would ask me if there's a way to put a second channel in to make the Marshall channel switching and give them a low gain, what I call normal channel, which is just a lower gain, still crunchy, but lower gain thing for rhythm. And I did do a few channel switching ones, but that's just a whole nother animal, because doing that does require quite a bit of extensive work, because now I have to add an auxiliary power supply to power the channel switching circuitry. And then I have to add more controls. So now I've got to drill holes in the chassis to put an additional master volume, additional preamp control. And so those amps got to be a lot of work, and the end results were good. But at that point, for what I had to charge them to do the work and everything else, they probably would have been economically better off just buying, say, a Soldano, 100 plus or 50 plus or something like that, because that's already got two channels, already has the mod, it's all that stuff they were looking for, but already in an amp. So I didn't really, but as far as the voicing goes, I never had anybody say like, oh, can you make this different? They just seemed to really like it the way it was. I did a few where I did change the presence control to add more low end thump, kind of like, on a Soldano, we call it the depth control. Other amps have those nowadays. They call them resonance or whatever. But anyway, it changes the presence control, by the way, works by, it's a feedback loop on the power amp. So it takes and you have to have some feedback on the power section just to keep it stable and to keep everything sounding good and keep stuff from running away. But what the presence control does is it reduces the amount of feedback on the high frequencies, which makes the high frequencies louder. Well, you can also do a thing where you reduce the feedback on the low frequencies, which will give the amp more thump in the power section. And that's what the depth control does. So I would do that. That was just a little additional mod. And then the only other additional thing that I would be asked for sometimes, and it took me a while to develop a good one, that was an effects loop. And so on some of those Marshall mods, I would add yet another tube. So now there's 5 preamp tubes back there, and I would put a loop in there. But the request for loops wasn't that much. I mean, maybe less than 10% of the mods I ever did have effects loops, probably more than 5%. So yeah, and as far as name artists, I don't really remember anybody that's really well known that had me do Marshall mods. Most of my well known names were Soldano customers. So Brett Muscat of Faster Pussycat has a modded Soldano, modded Marshall, and he loves it. I mean, he's still using it to this day. I did one for. Well, I've done some for some. I've done session players and stuff, but I've got to tell you, I'm not good with names, and as I've gotten older, I've forgotten a lot of them. So there are a lot of probably LA session guys that still have a modded Marshall in their arsenal, however.
Yeah. So I think it doesn't really have to be about names, but I'm just wondering if, in your experience, had anyone ever, come to you and just say, "Oh, hey, Mike, I got this sound in my head, and I kind of want to achieve that with what you do." Then can you like, were there any stories like that? Just like they had a sound in their head and asked you to do an amp to their sound in their head. That sort of story.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There have been a few guys like that over the years. And most of them, okay, so many of them had these ideas that it turned out weren't super effective to do. In other words, I kind of steered them in other directions. I would have said, well, like, oh, I understand what you want, but maybe you would be better off doing this by taking and using 2 amps instead of just 1. And so for example, I had one guy who wanted he wanted a 3-channel amp that just had 3 various levels of gain. Well, an SLO-100 has 2 levels, but it has 2 channels, but it has a normal channel and overhead channel. Well, I wasn't able to give him 3 channels, but I was able to give him 2 channels of high gain just by changing the switching circuit and eliminating the normal channel altogether, and just changing basically the preamp and master volume controls, just toggling those back and forth between 2 sets of controls and shoving them through the same gain circuit and everything else. And so I did a lot of those kind of weird mods on Soldano amps. When it came to the Marshall stuff, though, not so much. It would be, they came in, they got the mod I offered. Sometimes they asked for that 2nd channel, which like I said, I did a couple of those. But as far as sound in their head kind of stuff goes, I never really had the opportunity to tweak anything because I know what you're saying. Like they'd be like, "Oh, I love what you're doing there, but could you boost the mids?" That's what you mean. So like, never really had that with those mods. Again, they would sort of hear it, they would tweak the knobs a little bit, and they'd go, "Oh, there it is. That's what I was looking for." And so I never really strayed too much from the recipe, only because I wasn't asked. I was happy to do custom stuff, Soldano Custom Amplification. Custom is my middle name. So I was willing to do custom work, and we did do quite a bit of custom stuff on actual Soldano amps because, there we just had these customers, repeat customers who were just always looking for something a little bit different. And that's how we came up with a lot of the weird mods that you probably heard about on Soldanos. Like you've heard of the Warren Haynes mod, you've heard of the Warren DeMartini mod, which actually doesn't even exist. Somebody just thought that Warren had something different and he didn't. But so there's a lot of urban legend around a lot of that stuff too. But the thing is no, I never really had that experience, which is kind of strange considering that that's what drove me to design my own amp, was the sound I had in my head. So you would think that there'd be others that would want the same thing. But many of them, but when they came to me with their Marshall, like I say, I would do the mod, and I would, before they'd leave, I'd say, hey, play it for a while. If there's anything we can change here to make it more like what you hear in your head, I'm happy to do it. But I really never had to. They pretty much would take it. And I think, and part of it probably is because what they didn't realize when their amp was still the stock Marshall, they didn't realize that the tone controls did anything, because in a stock Marshall, they really don't do a lot. And I don't mean this in a disparaging way. It's just, they just didn't. They didn't have a lot of range. And partially it was because the voicing in the front of the preamp took away a lot of the frequencies that the tone stack needed to work with. And so they weren't there. So, sure, you could turn and hear a little bit of difference with knowledge. But after I did the mod, tone control became pretty effective. In other words, when you turn the mid-range control after the mod, it really made a difference. And you can really get those 80s scooped out mids that, were so popular back then. My mid-range control do that. Stock Marshall one, you turn it all the way to 0, and yeah, it would scoop, but it didn't scoop a lot. But once you did the mod, you turned it to 0, and it did scoop out the mids. And if you cranked it up, it really blasted the mids. So I think what happened was, because the amp became sort of more effective or more adjustable, they would take it home, spin a few knobs, try it, and be like, oh, wait, there's that sound. Whereas, a lot of time, and I used to see this all the time in my shop in Hollywood, especially, guys would come in to demo my amps. They'd come in and they'd turn all the tone controls to exactly straight up 12 o'clock. And they hit it, like, well, maybe it needs this or that. And I'm like, turn the knob. And they'd be like, well, I always set my amp just like this. And I'd be like, well, turn the knob. That's why I put knobs on it. If it was just going to be a 12 all the time, I would have hardwired it and it would be tone stack. And so they would turn the knobs, and all of a sudden they'd be like, oh my God, there's my sound. That's what I'm looking for. And so I think part of what the whole mod experience was with the Marshall was, not only did I mod their amp, but I also modified the way they use their amp, in that I got them to use the controls on the amp more to their advantage, instead of just always setting it in this one place and assuming that that's where it had to be. And so I think that a lot of these players found their sound not only because I modded the amp for them, but because I told them how to find the sound in that newly modded amp. So, yeah, I guess that's how I went about doing that.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great answer. So the next question I'm wondering is that, what specific guitar playing techniques have you observed guitarists using or developing due to the tones produced by a modified Marshall amps or Soldano amps, in your experience?
Yeah. Okay. That's a good question. I think it really opened up a, okay, so definitely the harder, heavier sounding music for sure, right? I mean, that's where we were all heading with it anyway. I mean, I was in the 80s, I was a full-blown metalhead, still am kind of, get kind of old for that, but you know what I mean? I can still rock out when nobody's around. But I think what it did is it allowed these guys, these already amazing guitarists that were already doing really incredible stuff. Your Randy Rhodeses, your Gary Hoey's, all of these cats. I think what it was doing, it was giving these guys the tools to push what they were doing even further. So, especially when it came to like all the hammer-on stuff and all these things where you really needed a high gain amp to pick up the relatively weak signal that the pickups were getting from tapping. Because when you're playing really fast, you can't really dig into the strings because that slows you down. You can't like, bury the pick in there and just, you have to play with a really light, fast touch, something I can't do, by the way, but you have to have this light touch. And I think when the amp was so responsive to what they were doing, when the amp became so touch sensitive, they realized they could play even faster because then they could play even lighter and they could get, and when the amp was articulating better than what they were used to hearing, I think, because that's the thing. I think a lot of these guys in the quest for higher gain early on, they were using, very crude stomp boxes because that was before the whole boutique pedal revolution happened, right? So all the stuff that was available back in those days wasn't that great. I hate to say it, but there just weren't that many good choices for a good overdrive pedal. Probably the best pedal that came from that whole era was probably, the Tube Screamer, right? So, but then the whole pedal thing exploded 10 years later, and now there are amazing overdrive pedals out there. I can't believe how amazing some of these things are these guys are building nowadays. It's a whole new world. But back then, not so great. So they were getting their distortion with their stock Marshall and then some crappy pedal, not crappy, but some less than sophisticated overdrive pedal. And they were probably noticing that they couldn't really do everything they wanted to do because eventually they hit that wall where everything mushed out or things got too discordant where, the pedal couldn't really reproduce the subtleties of what they were doing. It was too much, it was just too much stuff going on that they couldn't get it. And so I think once an amp came along, like the modern Marshall, that had this additional articulation and this clarity, where it still had distortion, but it's clear. And that's kind of a hard, it's kind of hard to explain it that way because when you think clarity, you think clean sound. And I'm not talking about clean. I'm talking about clarity in what you're doing, in the distorted sound, like note to note definition, string to string separation, the ability to play chords with more than 3 tones in them and still have all the notes ring out. I mean, you can literally take and play like a D minor 7 through a modded Marshall that I've done, and you hear every note in that chord, and it rings, it comes through. Whereas if you take and do that through, say, a rat distortion pedal going into, a Plexi Marshall, you're not going to hear all those notes. It's going to be just like that, right? So I think once the tools were there, that they found that, ooh, this amp can articulate. I can play more complicated stuff. I can throw in these weird, minor triplets. I can do this really discordant, like strange thing, and it'll sound good instead of sounding just like that, right? And so I think what happened was, as the tools became more refined, and by tools I mean the high gain amp, and nowadays the pedals as well, as tools became more refined, the players could push the boundaries of what they were doing. And so I noticed like the heavy chuggy rhythm stuff got even heavier and chuggier because all of a sudden here's this high gain amp that can also deliver this just gut punching low end chug that would hold together. It wouldn't flop out. It wouldn't get all loose and break up and kind of like sloppy and weird to where then the recording engineer has to try to fix it in the mix somehow, Instead, you had an amp that could really deliver the goods. And so I think it made heavy metal heavier, or allowed players to play heavier, but also I think it allowed players that were more inclined to play more melodic type of stuff, where it gave them the confidence to actually take a single note and hold it a little bit longer. Like they didn't have to worry about it fading off or starting to get out into that fizzly, crackly, just falling off the map place. They could go, "Wah," and then know that, oh, I can hold this another 2 seconds and it's still going to be there. It's not going to drop out underneath me. So I think the evolution of the amps gave players confidence to then evolve their playing. And so I think it created a whole new kind of evolution in how technical guitar came along, because I know that, uh, a lot of the guys I would see that would come in my Hollywood shop were studying up at GIT. So Guitar Institute of Technology was just up the street from where my shop was, less than a mile or two away. So a lot of those guys who were down there, going to GIT would come in. I think it's now called Musicians Institute of Technology. I think they changed the name. Anyway, when they would come in, I noticed them doing like, hammer on and all, a lot of the Eddie Van Halen technique and stuff. And I would kind of see their faces light up when they realized that, I don't have to hit the string so hard. I can actually, I'm sounding more like I want to sound. And I think they were able to do that because the amp was giving them what they needed to do that. And so I think it really did help evolve where shred, for lack of a better description, shred guitar was going. And then in other fields, again, for maybe the guys that were just, or the players that just wanted real percussive rhythmic stuff, like kind of how metal sort of evolved in the 90s to where it was more just, like chug, and almost more percussive. I think, the modded amps really helped that too, because again, they could kind of give that fist punch low end that the stock amp didn't quite have. I mean, a stock Marshall does have some chug, but it's not just that gut punching chug that a modded one has.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's great. Great answer. Appreciate it. Now I'm gonna hand it back to Austin for the next question.
Yeah, great, great answer, Mike. It's kind of, before I ask the next question, it's kind of in a way, you're kind of describing, I guess, like refined distortion, right? You've got this distortion, but it's refined, it's controlled, but at the same time, it's as aggressive as you want. It's we can have all sorts of interesting linguistic discussions around that when we write this up. But I'm gonna be, again, just winding back. We tapped into this a little. I mean, you can think about, again, your time in Seattle, your time in LA, maybe even fast forward to the advent of the internet, forum discussions, message boards, all this stuff. I'm not really too sure, how much you engage with any of that. But can you tell us maybe a little bit about this sort of any interactions with this kind of sharing of techniques or a sense of community or kind of culture around that? And how did you find, your knowledge and expertise and, your pioneer mod and your development of, the iconic amplifier, the Soldano, how do you think all that, sort of work together in your experience, this kind of bigger network of technicians and modifiers?
Good question. Well, let's see. Okay, like I say, early on, I didn't really interact with a lot of people, only because, well, I'm kind of inherently a shy guy, so I wasn't really going out of my way to, make connections. However, over time, I would run into people and meet people and stuff like that. My first, and again in Seattle, not so much was going on. I mean, my focus when I was still in Seattle was I was still trying to be a guitar player who happened to build an amp for himself, but then it happened to become popular. Well, by the time it became popular, I was in LA that's when all that happened. None of that happened when I was in Seattle. So in Seattle, I was still this completely unknown guitarist with this cool amp that a couple guys in a certain rehearsal studio knew about. And that was really about it. So when I left Seattle to go to LA in 1987, there was probably only a handful of friends I had in Seattle that really even knew what I was doing. So I didn't really leave any kind of vacuum because nobody knew I was there to begin with. I was just sort of quietly working in the background. When I got to LA, for the first year I was there, nobody knew who I was either or what I was doing because, hey, LA is a huge city, and who cares if there's some new guy that just happened to, move in with what he thought was a really brilliant idea. So, so I was pretty unknown. How I became known was, just diligently trying to get the thing out there and being fortunate enough to get into the network of some of the top players in LA through the introduction of the amp, Steve Lukather. That's kind of how it all started for the LA scene. I had sold an amp prior to that, however, to Howard Leese apart, but nobody really took much notice of that. It's like all of a sudden Howard had this killer tone, but it didn't really do much for my recognition or business. So once I got to LA, or once I started getting established in LA, I did meet other builders. I met Steve Fryette. I met Reinhold Bogner. In fact, there was a studio rental company in North Hollywood called Andy Brower Studio Rentals. And the owner, Andy Brower, was pretty much tied in with all the LA session cats, everything else, because his business offered them gear storage and cartage. And so that's where Lukather kept all of his gear. That's where Peter Frampton had his stuff. I mean, everybody stored their gear there, and then he would send it out to studios when they had sessions. They'd call them, go, hey, send my rack to blah, blah, blah. We're doing a session today. And his guys would take it out and they'd set it up. And so he was really dialed in with all those guys. And he had an amazing collection of vintage amps, amazing collection of vintage guitars that he rented out and all that. So he was his place was sort of a cultural hub for all the real heavy hitter guitar players in LA. And so I met him through the whole, Lukather thing. And then through him and through that, well, actually not so much through him, but through Lukather, I met Bob Bradshaw, who was at the time the major rack builder for all the stars in LA as well. So I got to know him and what he was doing. And he was really great in helping me out with a lot of stuff too, because he introduced me to even more players. He inspired me to build what became my 3-channel preamp, the X88R. But anyway, to get back to that, so Andy Brower early on introduced me to Stevie Fryette and to Reinhold, and we actually did a little panel discussion thing at GIT. Andy set the whole thing up. We all showed up. We talked about what we were doing. And Stevie had been around longer than I had. He'd already been in LA for a while. He was already building amps before I was. And then there was me, and then Reinhold had just moved to the States at that point, I believe. And so he was still a pretty fresh face. But anyway, we all sat up there. We just had a question and answer thing with the audience, and we talked, geeked out on amps and stuff. And so that was kind of a cool experience, but those kind of experiences just didn't happen that often for me. I found that I was pretty much working on my own most all the time. What I did notice, however, as I got more successful, was there were a number of people out there that were deciding that they were going to just take use of my technology and put it in their products. I'm not going to name any names. You can see all that on the internet somewhere, and so I won't have to go into that now. But anyway, and at the time that was pretty disheartening for me because it kind of bummed me out. Later, I just took it to be like, well, hey, if they're copying me, I must be doing something right, So that's cool. But because of that, I tended to be a bit wary of sharing a lot of stuff back then. I guess I was just a little bit, feeling a little bit too much pressure, and I probably wasn't as mature as I am now. So I took it a little more. I took a little more offense to it. So anyway, it's all water under the bridge. I don't care, and I'm fine with it. But the thing is I think because of that, I tended to sort of cloak what I was doing. I mean, nowadays I'm more than happy to share what I know with anybody because I'm not going to be around forever, and I'd love this information to be out there. And it already is. I mean, it is. People, I'm really excited to see a lot of these young builders that are, striking out on their own and coming up with some great products. And I'm glad to see that they're innovating too. I mean, they're not just copying anymore. They're actually innovating and doing their own thing. And so I think that the internet has been a huge tool in making that happen. I'm not active online. I'm not a tech guy, and I don't like spending time sitting in front of a computer, and I'm not very good at doing the whole oh, you asked a question, I better respond kind of thing. I don't, because my wife tells me I should have an Instagram channel, for example, or Instagram thing, because I'm always building and tinkering and stuff, right? She goes, oh, people would love to know how you did that. And the thing is, I'm like, yeah, I'd love to show them, but I don't want to answer the questions because I don't have the time because I want to build the next thing, right? So maybe that's a little selfish of me. I don't know, but as you get older, you find that your time is much more valuable because you have less of it. And so I'm glad to see, though, that there are people who have taken the time to study what it is that I did and what Dave Friedman did, and all these guys have done, because, they're the ones that are going to take that information, that knowledge, and they're going to incorporate it into what they're doing. They're going to keep on going with it. The other thing that's really exciting is that when I was first working on my stuff back in the late 70s and early 80s, it was really hard to find parts to build back in tube amps because at that point, the large electronic world, the commercial electronics, had decided the vacuum tube was a dead player, non-starter. Televisions didn't have tubes in them anymore. Radios didn't have tubes. Nothing had tubes. Nobody wanted to deal with tubes. So it got very hard to find high voltage capacitors, for example, because solid state stuff operates at much lower voltages. So there was you had to really be on a treasure hunt to find the parts you needed to build a vacuum tube amp back then. You had to scrounge. You had to go to the surplus stores. You had to go to major electronics distribution houses and ask for these parts specifically for what you wanted. Transformers were impossible to find because nobody was winding high voltage secondary power transformers or audio output transformers. That matter because, again, solid state stereo amps don't need an output transformer, so there's no need for them. And even if they did, the impedances would be all wrong. So it's hard to find parts. Luckily, because of all the interest in the boutique thing that started happening, towards the late 80s, some really cool companies popped up like Antique Radio Supply in Arizona, CE Distribution, which is the same company, different name. But Mojo Parts, Mojo Tone, Magic Parts, a bunch of these companies started popping up on Sovtech, for example. And they started seeing that there was a need or that there was an interest in building guitar amplifiers. So they started offering various parts that we needed to do this, because by the end of the 80s, all the American manufacturing vacuum tubes ceased to exist, pretty much. at least the stuff we were using. Like I think I bought one of the very last shipments of Philips Sylvania 6L6s, and then all of a sudden they weren't anymore. They quit making them because their main contractor or their main customer up to that point was the U.S. military. So when the U.S. military mothballed all their 1950s stuff that used vacuum tubes, all of a sudden there's no market for. I mean, we think there's a lot of guitar players out there that, oh yeah, there's enough guitar players. Well, for a big company like Philips Sylvania, we wouldn't even make a blip on their radar for sales. So they just quit making tubes because they were like, there's no market for tubes. So fortunately, guys like Mike Matthews at Sovtech went to Russia and found, 5881s and brought them into the country. And other guys like, I'm spacing on his name now. That's so embarrassing. Aspen Pittman, thank you. God, memory, you saved me. Aspen Pittman, who had groove tubes, went to Europe and found, JJ tubes and various other brands and brought those back. And so all of a sudden there became this resurgence in interest in this stuff, enough so that these cottage industries would pop up. So now you can go to like Mojo Tone, you can buy a whole kit to build a clone of a Fender Bassman. So it's a perfect place for somebody who wants to get started in messing around with vacuum tube amplifiers. You can build a Marshall clone from the kit, as a matter of fact. You can buy a kit from these guys to build a plexi, 100-watt plexi. And what it does is it gives a whole new generation or generations. Now we're actually probably into another generation of tinkerers and hobbyists and amp nerds like myself a chance to build this stuff and experiment with it and try stuff. And now it's better than ever because there's all this information out there. There's become so much interest in it. A bunch of people have written books about it. You can buy, again, I was learning it from 1940s Army and Navy radio manuals because back then, the Navy and the Army had a really good way to educate servicemen to get up to speed in a very short amount of time. So they cut out all the like super techie stuff and just gave you what you needed to know to be able to repair and design and understand vacuum tube electronic circuits. Well, I had to learn it that way. There were no books on like, this is how a guitar amp works. There's nothing like that. Now there are volumes of books on guitar amps and guitar circuits and how to build pedals and do all. So it's a rich time as far as the knowledge base goes, because there's so much more awareness now about what our predecessors did. The Western Electric guys in the 30s, the engineer whose name I forget right now, who designed all of Fender's stuff, the Ken Brands that did work for Marshall. All these guys are now are much more known than they ever were back when they were doing their craft. And and guys like myself and Dave Friedman and others, we're sort of like we're kind of the wells of information that are now being passed to others. So it's really actually even though technology is zooming so far into the digital world, it's interesting that at the same time, vacuum tubes are having probably the biggest rebirth they could have possibly ever had, in a time when it seems like the most unlikely technology to be popular. So it's really cool. I'm really excited about it. And again, even doing something like we're doing right now is putting more of that knowledge out there for more people to absorb, to take in, to adopt to their own needs, whatever. So it's really an exciting time. And like I said, I'm still kind of tinkering and doing my thing and doing some side work for Soldano. I'm not involved with the hands-on making stuff anymore. I'm still tinkering around, and I think that by exposure there will be more people that become interested in it. So I think it's a good time for all this stuff. And I think there is a large internet community that just geeks out on this stuff day in and day out, 24/7. If I had more time, I'd be part of it. I'm really not. When people bring things to my attention, I sometimes like go on and, watch some interview that somebody thought I'd be interested in hearing, and some little story or whatever. Or occasionally they'll send me some link to something that some guy's doing that's really amazing. I'll be like, that's really cool. But I tend to be, I don't know, for lack of a better word, a bit of a hermit. And so I'm not as active as I maybe should be, but at the same time, I'm really glad that all that activity is happening.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. It's sometimes it can be information overload, can't it? There's so much stuff.
That's true.
That's the other issue. I'm going to hand you over back to Jan. He's going to we've tapped into this now, into the kind of per day future, evolution of things. And yeah, Jan will ask you a couple of questions around those themes.
Cool.
Are we gonna do number 9?
Yeah, I've wrapped 2 into 1. Yeah, I wrapped 2 into 1 there. So
okay, so so historically and looking to the future, then how do you see the future of amp modding and the amp modding community evolving with the rise of digital technologies like Camper or amp sims and stuff like that? Where do you see that go?
Well, that's an interesting one. I think as far as the modding goes, it may be plateauing a little bit. And the reason I say that is because the value of the original amps is going up so much because they're becoming collectibles. They're becoming collector's items. Whereas in 1985, it wouldn't have been that big of a deal if I would have, and it wasn't a big deal if I tore into a, 1969 Plexi Marshall and just modded the heck out of it. But now, an original intact Plexi Marshall is worth a lot of money. And so I think what's happened is the raw material for doing mods is shrinking a little bit. In other words, there's only a finite number of 1980s and late 70s JMPs out there to mod. So when those get all modded up or get buried in somebody's garage, never to be seen for another 50 years or something, there's just not going to be that much stuff to mod. And unfortunately, a lot of the new amps that are being built don't lend themselves very well to mods because if you come into the real new stuff, a lot of it uses surface mount technology, which is really hard for home hobbyists to really work with. And also because of the constant pressure by corporate, bean counters in some of these companies to make products cheaper and more, market friendly with bigger markups and everything else. A lot of the really purely tube designs are disappearing. In other words, you buy a 100-watt Marshall nowadays, and again, I don't even keep up with all the latest models just because it's too mind-boggling. But chances are it's going to have a ton of ICs in there and solid state stuff that's going to be replacing what tubes did, like reverb drivers. You don't have to move the tube to drive a reverb bank. You can easily do it with a chip. But for a home hobbyist that's working with, just simple tools and whatnot, tubes are easier and more forgiving to work with. So they're going to prefer working on an amp like that. Now, part of this is my own prejudice towards solid state stuff. So I'm inflicting a little of my own thing on this. So maybe maybe these younger guys are totally comfortable working with surface mount technology. Maybe they're fine with chips. I'm not that guy. So I think mods will still keep happening, but they probably won't be happening the way they were, when I started doing them, and when Frank Levi was doing them, and when Stevie Fryette and B. Jackson, all those guys, that stuff I don't see moving too much further in the future. I think some of that stuff is probably going to fade out as those of us that did it fade out, to put it nicely. As far as the digital thing goes, though, I think as much as it's a great tool for a lot of players, I mean, I've seen huge leaps and bounds. I mean, I've even seen the stuff that Soldano has done with neural DSP and all that, where my mind has been blown by what you can now do with digital that I didn't think would ever have been possible 10 years ago. I mean, if you would have asked me 10 years ago if somebody could have built a solid state SLO pedal, for example, I'd say there's no way in hell. We'd never get the sound. But we did it, boutique amps, and with my feedback and their amazing engineering, boutiques came up with a pedal that sounds like an SLO-100. It just kind of blows my mind. So anyway, I think the digital, but that's not digital, that's still analog. But saying that, the modeling, the digital stuff, getting back to that, like the Kempers and the Neurals and all those things, they're getting better and better all the time. There's no denying it. They're making a lot of headway. The stuff is getting pretty seamless. And so for the guy that's recording at home with headphones, with his computer, has to do it in an apartment, can't have real amps blaring, it's great that those tools are out there because it gives them the ability to get some incredible sounds on their digital audio workstation thing and record stuff that sounds totally believable and totally doable. But I think there will always be the kind of guy like myself who likes the feel of playing a real amp with speaker cabinets blowing at my legs. I can't handle high volume as much anymore because I have tinnitus, so I have to kind of wear earplugs, tone it down a little. But still, there's a very visceral thing you get when you play a guitar through a real amp is sitting right in front of you, where you can move closer and further away from the speaker to control your feedback, where you can get these weird, minor little noisy things that you can do that a digital thing can't quite emulate, because the digital thing is still emulating something. It's still not directly interacting with what you're doing. So when you have a distorted note coming through a modeled Soldano, for example, as I understand it anyway, it's the modeler going, yes, when I see this frequency coming into my input, I access this thing that makes this sound that we've sampled of the Soldano, and we're gonna spit it out like that, and that's what it's to do. But there is no feedback of the speaker working with the guitar strings and that magnetics of the pickup doing that kind of organic loop that happens, that analog thing that happens with, like, say, feedback and stuff like that. So I think as far as a feeling goes, notice on tape, you could probably use a real amp with a good engineer and a digital amp with a good engineer. And when you got done with all the mixing, mastering, and everything else, nowadays with the technology you have, I bet you can make it so you couldn't tell the difference. I mean, the technology is that good. The digital technology is that good that probably in a recording environment, you'd never know. But as a player, what you feel when you're playing, I think there's always going to be something about that, having that amp sitting there right next to you or behind you or on a chair, tipped back, aimed at your ear, blasting outside your head or whatever. there's going to be that thing that isn't going to be replaceable with a digital deal. So I think that's what will keep amp modding and amp manufacturing and amp building, like as a hobbyist building amps. That'll keep that alive. I think as far as commercial viability, it may eventually taper off only because the economics of building real amps, especially tube amps. I mean, tube amps are economically not a viable product to manufacture. It takes a lot to do it. The parts are expensive. The labor is intense. And so it's going to be a thing where if you can afford it, you can still have a tube amp, but there's going to be a time when tube amps are just going to kind of creep out of the affordability zone and leave a lot of, players that are starting out and everything else gravitating immediately for the digital do-it-all box that does everything. Because that's the other thing too, is people have gotten spoiled. They expect more out of an amp. They expect more features. They want built-in, speaker emulation. I mean, we're doing it at Soldano now. We're putting IRs in there and all that because that's what people want and expect. I think in the past, the expectations were lower, so you can build a simpler product and still make people happy. I think now the expectations are higher, so the product is getting more complicated. It's having to offer more stuff. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's a shift. And it's a shift that I think is going to move the whole hobby aspect of amp modding, for example, a little bit away from that. In other words, a guy like myself in the 80s who could, say, hey, I'm an amp modder and get away with just switching a couple of resistors and caps in a Marshall and call it a mod and get away and get paid for it. I think that's not going to be as easy to do nowadays because technology has gotten more complicated and the raw material to do the mods on is getting farther and fewer between. I mean, again, in 1970, and I wasn't doing mods as early as 1970, but in 1970, you pretty much could not even give away a 410 Fender 56 Bassman. Nobody wanted them. They were like old fashioned. They were tweed. They had 10-inch speakers. Nobody cared. So to do a mod on one of those in 1970, nobody would have said a thing about it. If you were to so much as change a cap in a 1956 Fender Bassman today, you would destroy its collector's value. So if you had an original tweed Bassman you found in your grandfather's attic or grandmother's attic, and you took it to have it modded, whoever modded that amp would be struck down by a bolt of lightning for destroying a vintage amp. He would be thrashed on the internet. He would, go straight to hell. You know what I'm saying? So the thing is, the raw material isn't available anymore. I mean, the perfect amp to mod to any beginner is a JMP Marshall. I would say this all day long. Or better yet, a Plexi, because Plexis have turret circuit boards, which makes it easier to change parts out on. So yeah, take that 69 Plexi and go to town on it. But you can't do it anymore because it's too valuable. Just like you wouldn't change the pickups in a 57 Sunburst Gibson Les Paul. It's like in the old days, those were just guitars you played and you changed pickups. You put it back. I swear to God, I don't think it was a 57, but it was a very old Les Paul come across my bench when I worked at Stars Guitars in San Francisco for one summer. And somebody had put a Floyd Rose in it. They had routed out that old Gibson body, carved it all up, put a Floyd in it. That guitar nowadays unmolested is probably, $50,000 guitar. But back then it was just another old Les Paul. So I think the same thing is going to kind of happen with the vintage amps. But the fact that there's companies like Mojo Tone and these others, they're offering kits to build basically from scratch a Plexi Marshall, that gives me hope because that means a guy can buy a kit or gal can buy a kit, build that amp to what it would have been as if it were a stock 69 Plexi, follow the instructions, and then go to town on it. Do all the mods you want because you know what? It's just a kit you bought. and you're not going to ruin its value by screwing around with it. So have fun, dig in there, try some stuff, make some adjustments, melt a few parts, try it again. I think I think that's where it's going to go. But as far as the modding original amps anymore, just because the inventory of those is diminishing and the value for the originals is going up, I think we're going to see a taper as far as, the modifying of original Marshalls, original Fenders, original whatevers. I just don't think it's a sustainable deal. Did that answer that, or did I get up on a wrong tangent?
That's amazing. Yeah.
Okay.
Good to hear. Awesome.
But
Thank you.
digital-
Appreciate it.
Oh yeah, but like I say, the digital thing is going to fill the needs of a lot of players in the future. There's just no doubt about it. I don't think people are going to be as snobbish as say I am about it. They're going to be like, hey, it sounds good, it does the job, it gets me to the gig, I can plug it directly into the PA at the club, I don't even have to have speakers on stage. This actually suits me better than hauling my 100-watt half stack in here. So I think that's going to be there, but I think there's always going to be players like Joe Von Massa, for example, who loves the vintage stuff, who just you see him, you see his eyes light up every time he plugs in one of his little toys in his amazing collection. He gets all excited about it because there's this physical non-audio thing that happens. The smell of the tubes warming up. Even. I mean, there's all these weird little visceral things that have nothing to do with the sound of the amp, but it has to do playing experience. And I think that's what will keep guys and gals coming back into amps and to just, real amps in general. There'll always be that thing.
Thank you.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I think, we didn't ask question 9. I think I realized kind of what you were getting at because we've got Mike Soldano here, but the question was around.
That's what I was asking.
Yeah, you've kind of answered it, and obviously you're a major part of it. But I mean, so let's say Marshall modifications. We were kind of asking a question around how have Marshall modifications kind of put us on this trajectory where we've got these high gain amplifiers, many brands that I can't even think of now, and obviously yours was a big one. So that's kind of why thought we weren't answering the question. But again, would you say that this whole modification process was all part of that evolution?
Oh, definitely, because let's face it, had it not been for that basic Marshall sound, none of us would have had anything to even start with, or even had the idea to start with. In other words, if we hadn't heard people already playing like, distorted guitar, because, and of course back, all those recordings made in the 60s and 70s, it was basically a non-master ball. It wasn't even a JMP. It was probably a plexi or something with the volumes dimed where the amp was getting, all this distortion from the power section and not from the preamp. But it was that sound, and that was the classic rock sound, for lack of a better label. I hate that term because it's sounds like a radio DJ line. But anyway, but it is a classic, and so 1970s. I'm a teenager. The impression that crunchy guitar put in my brain, listening to Led Zeppelin, listening to Jimi Hendrix, listening to Cream, that sound embedded in my brain. And so it made an imprint that later, when I started playing guitar, I want to have that crunchy, cool sound. Where did that sound come from? It came from a Marshall amp, or a Marshall amp with some real cheesy distortion pedal plugged in front. So it created I guess you'd call it it planted the seed of what later became that sound in my head that I just had to have, but I had to design an amp to accomplish. But had it not been for all those crunchy, cranked up Marshalls in the past, had it not been for Judas Priest blaring out of my car stereo speakers and hearing just that, just that great distorted guitar sound. And mind you, maybe a lot of that was made even bigger sounding because of effects that were done in the recording studio. But it doesn't matter, because all that matters is the impression it gave to guys like myself and many, many others of what a rock guitar should sound like. Because up to that point, you go back to the 50s, and what people thought a good guitar sounded like was a whole different thing. They it was clean. They played big, thick, hollow jazz guitars. It's real, flat wound strings. It was a whole different vibe. But when Chuck Berry took his Fender Bassman, probably, I don't know what his amp was, he probably had like a little Fender amp, and cranked way up and got the amp distorting, that was the beginning of like that rock and roll sound. And then you move into the 60s and you've got Clapton standing in front of a wall of 100-watt Marshalls, and they're cranked. And now you've got the sound of Cream, or, prior to that, Blues Breakers or whatever. All of a sudden, that's this thing. And so, yes, I'd say the whole trajectory was launched because of a bunch of maniac guitar players that were looking for just loud, big sound. Didn't have the technology to do it then, but they knew that if they cranked the amp wide open, they could get pretty close to what they wanted. And then you plug a fuzz face in front of it, and you've got that, and it's like, oh, it's getting better. And so I think the sonic imprint that those early pioneer rocker guys put in the psyches of guys that were teenagers in the 70s, like myself, created this deal that was then the seed for, like, I've got the sound in my head and it's even heavier than what they had. And this is how I have to do it. So I better get to work modding these amps to get that. And so, yeah, I think the modded Marshall thing, and that's where it came from. I mean, even like say, in my case, it was a little interesting because it happened to be happening in parallel. My mods were happening in parallel with my own exploration.
Mm-hmm.
But had I never even built my own amp, and I would have still taken what I had evolved my Marshall mod to, I would have put that in the Marshall. And if I was a better guitar player, I'd probably be out there touring the world playing this modded Marshall instead of starting an amp company, because that would have been the easier way to go. Instead of building my own amp, I could have taken that modded Marshall, gone out and done it, had the same sound, been happy, rocked it out. Didn't happen that way. But I think what I'm trying to say here is that, yes, all of the modern high gain sound evolved from all of us guys tinkering around with old Marshalls back then, because Marshalls were affordable back then. I mean, the first one I ever bought, I paid, I think $400 for. It was used, and it wasn't even that old. I bought it in the late 70s, and I think it was a 76. It was 3 years old, and I bought it for $400. So, that was a lot of money in 1979, but still, it wasn't bank breaking. I mean, my Mesa Boogie at the time cost $1,400. So it was an affordable way to get into it. And so, because the amps, and they were plentiful, there was a lot of those amps around. And in fact, a little sides. I mean, I'm not trying to veer off of answering the question, but this is an interesting side story. When I first started doing my Marshall mods in LA, of course, guys would bring me their amps to do mods. Well, pretty soon I started getting phone calls from guys like, hey, they call me up like, hey, Mike, I'd like to get my Marshall mod, or I'd like to get a Marshall mod. They wouldn't say I'd like to get my Marshall mod, because what I didn't realize yet, they didn't have the amp yet. I'd like to get a Marshall mod. And I'd go, great, bring it on in. Well, I don't have the amp. Which one should I go get? So they were actually asking me which amp to buy to bring me to modify. And so I'd be like, well, go get yourself a JMP 50 or a JMP 100. So those are my favorite ones to modify. So these guys were then going out and buying a stock JMP or or even a plexi, and then bringing it to me to get that mod because they knew they wanted that sound. They wanted that mod because they heard their friends. They don't even have the Marshall yet. So they would go buy the Marshall, bring it to me and have me mod it because they couldn't yet afford, $2,000 or $2,500 Soldano, but they heard their friends modded Marshall and that's the sound they wanted. So they'd go and buy a Marshall, bring it to me, have me modify it. And then they would be like off the races and they'd be like, this is great. So yes, the modded Marshall is definitely a stepping stone to all the high gain amps that are out there now. I mean, whether a lot of these guys that are building amps today ever own a Marshall or not, I don't really know, but I would bet they listened to all those records that had a Marshall on them, and that's what planted the seed, the sonic seed that gave them like the groundwork for what they wanted to build from as far as creating the tones they created. It certainly was the case for me. I mean, like I say, I listened to all those artists back then and still do. And whether consciously or not, I could acknowledge it then. It was definitely influencing what I thought I heard in my head for that magical sound. Probably the only exception to any of those being Carlos Santana, who never really used the Marshall, as far as I know. But he had a modified Fender. So, I mean, he already had a modded amp. That's how he was getting that tone. He wasn't getting that from the stock twin. I'll tell you that right now. So that whole tonal journey, or probably, I know for most of the guys in my own generation, started with some kind of Marshall amplifier because, or maybe a high watt. But high watts didn't break up like a Marshall. So it's probably a Marshall. And that planted the seed for then what we later refined to be our sound, or what we heard in our heads, which created the need to mod and do all that. So yes, it was, I think if it weren't for those screaming walls of amps in all those, 60s concert halls and recordings, we wouldn't be where we are today, for sure. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. So the point you made actually about people phoning you up and saying, can you mod a Marshall, and they haven't got it. It's funny that Dan Gower, he's a younger modder in England. He tells similar stories, and nowadays he's getting people phoning him up, and he's then sourcing a used JCM-100 on eBay to find the perfect donor amp, and then bringing it in, modding it, and then sending it to the customer.
Yes, that's what he did.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think they're also getting some of the kind of, they've done the little 20-watt reissues of the Plexi and the JCM 800, and I think a lot of people are just getting them buying it straight from one of the equivalent of Sweetwater in the States, say, and then sending it straight to him. He's doing the mod on it, and then so they don't even get to touch the amp that they bought, the brand new amplifier. It's just going straight to mod. So there's still a lot of what you're saying going on today, just in different ways, really. But yeah, we've reached the end of the questions, Mike, and again, massive thank you for taking part in this. And you've got a gift of storytelling. You've been really able to tell some brilliant stories with loads of details, but also the great thing is you've answered our question every single time with lots of great stories and anecdotes. So yeah, thank you so much for that.